So maybe we can start with how you came to become a teacher of non-duality.
I never had the intention to speak or even write about these matters. I was an artist for 30 or so years. I had a deep interest all of my life, all of my adult life since my mid-teens in these matters. So I was always studying, exploring, practicing, but it was never an intention of mine ever to speak or write. However, I was writing for my own purposes, and at one stage, a friend of mine suggested that I send a collection of essays to a publisher. I did. They liked them. They published the book, the first book, The Transparency of Things, as a result of which I began to receive invitations to go and speak around the world about these matters, which I was happy to do. I would go off and come back to my studio where I imagined I would spend the rest of my life. But then these invitations began to increase, and I was enjoying it very much. It was, having spent 30 years in my studio, it was nice to be out and about, traveling, and above all, talking about the thing the subject about that I love above all else. So after a couple of years of this, the invitations were such that I could really no longer carry on both lives, my private life as an artist in my studio and traveling the world speaking about these matters. And I just gravitated towards the latter, never having had the intention to do so. I still don't consider myself a teacher, or I just enjoy writing and speaking about these matters. So it came about through no particular volition of my own.
Right. Sounds very organic and very natural.
Exactly. Exactly.
And did you train in other traditions before you came to non-duality, which is what we'll be talking about today?
Well, the non-dual understanding, I would suggest, is the core of all the great religious and spiritual traditions. So I grew up in a Christian tradition and always had a feeling for the Christian tradition. I explored the Sufi tradition, and then I came across the classical Advaita Vedanta tradition from India, and then more recently the Kashmir Shaivite, the tantric approach of Kashmir Shaivism. So I explored in all these traditions, although really my foundation was in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, and then more recently the tantric tradition of Kashmir Shaivism. But it was always the non-dual core of these traditions that interested me. So I felt that I was always exploring the same thing. I didn't have the feeling that I was exploring 4 different traditions. I felt that I was exploring one, the great tradition as it is expressed by various different cultures at different times and places.
And is there a significant difference in the way one teaches in the tradition of Kashmir Shaivism versus Advaita Vedanta?
In the way one teaches, no. The way the teaching takes place is like this, through conversation. Sometimes I find myself speaking to 500 people, sometimes to 50 people, sometimes to one person. And the teaching is, or I should say the understanding, the non-dual understanding is continually reformulating itself afresh in response to the situation in which it is being expressed.
And you mentioned that the Kashmir Shaivism is a kind of tantric tradition. What is if it's not in the teaching, what is the difference there in the two traditions?
Yes. Broadly speaking, and it is very broadly speaking, the Vedantic tradition is a path that I sometimes refer to it as the inward-facing path. It is a path that emphasizes the turning away from the content of experience. thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, perceptions, activities, relationships, backwards or inwards to the one that knows them, or the one that is aware of them, the knowing subject of all objective experience. So the Vedantic tradition is, on the whole, an exclusive tradition. It is the via negativa, the excluding of objective experience. Whereas the Tantric tradition is, one could say, an inclusive tradition. The outward-facing path, as I sometimes refer to it, by which I mean the path that includes the content of experience, thoughts, images, feelings, etc. Now, I don't mean the way I've just described them suggest that these are two very distinct traditions. They're not. The Tantric approach is implicit in the Vedantic teaching, the outward-facing path, the path of inclusion. It is implicit in the Vedantic teaching, but is not very often elaborated. In my opinion, the inward-facing path is best, the outward-facing path is best elaborated by the Tantric tradition. And although the converse is also true in the Vedantic, in the Tantric tradition, the inward-facing path is included, but not so much attention is given to it. So I feel that the great contribution that the Vedantic teaching makes to the great tradition is this very clear, clean, precise method of returning one's attention to its source. The great contribution of the Tantric tradition is the realignment of the way we experience the body and the world with our new enlightened understanding. So I don't see these two traditions as opposing in many ways. They both have their strengths, and I wouldn't say they had their weaknesses. It's just that the inward-facing path is not so emphasized in the Tantric tradition, and vice versa, the outward-facing path not so emphasized, although it is implicit in the Vedantic tradition. I grew up in the Vedantic tradition for 20 or so years, and then discovered although I was always practicing without realizing it, the Tantric tradition in my studio as an artist, but it wasn't formalized until I came across the Kashmir Shaivite approach a little later on.
And I guess also Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism, I guess, is in the Tantric tradition, right? This kind of
all-inclusive, yes,
and that's something that really resonates with me.
Absolutely. Yeah. The only reason I mention the Kashmir Shaivite tradition of Abhinavagupta and Simaraja is just because that was the tradition that I followed and studied and practiced. But there are very close parallels in the Dzogchen and Vajrayana tradition. Yes, certainly.